Good morning, everyone. Today we're looking at an often overlooked conflict which took place in an often overlooked country. We're talking about the Spanish Civil War, which took place between July of 1936 and April of 1939, so in the middle of this period of the interwar years. The Spanish Civil War is often seen as an anticipation, a prelude of the Second World War. It saw Italian fascists and German Nazis fighting together against volunteers sent by the Soviet Union in a war which was absolutely fundamental for the development of modern weapons, tactics and techniques that were going to be used much more extensively in World War II. When tackling the Spanish Civil War, we're going to ask ourselves whether it really was or not a dress rehearsal for World War II, and in particular we're going to look at the following points. So, first of all, the background. They are going to go very briefly through the history of the Second Spanish Republic. We're barely touching it. Then we're going to look at how the Communist International sent volunteers to Spain, and how the Nazis and fascist regimes of Germany and Italy also sent their own volunteers, in air quotes, to Spain. Then we'll try to find a couple of similarities with World War II and what were the differences with World War II. And eventually we're going to ask ourselves the question, was the Spanish Civil War really an anticipation of World War II? The answer is, of course, as always, yes and no. So let's start by looking at the background. Spain, if you remember from our module on Queen Elizabeth, used to be one of the most powerful countries in Europe and in the world during the 16th century. However, after the 17th century, it's a long story, but the country's power began to decline very quickly. And by the 20th century, it had become a poor and backward country, especially when compared to more industrialized and economically powerful nations like Germany, Britain, and France. In 1931, a group of politicians who were dissatisfied, let's say, with the government of the Spanish military dictator Primo de Rivera overthrew him, abolished the monarchy and established a republic. Here you can see in the picture a personification of the Spanish Republic with its flag, which is one of the very few flags with the purple color. The scales, which are a personification, which are a symbol of justice, the Phrygian hat, a symbol of republicanism, and so on. 5 years later, in 1936, the units of the Spanish army that were stationed in Morocco, which was a Spanish protectorate at the time, it was a puppet state of Spain, let's say almost a colony. These troops in Morocco, which were led by the fascist Spanish general Francisco Franco, rose up against the Republic and took control of most of southern and western Spain. It was the beginning of the Civil War. Now, in June 1936, the League of Nations, as the guarantor of international order, asked its members, and also the other powers who were not its members, to not intervene, okay? And all the most important powers in the world, including Germany, Italy, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, decided to remain officially neutral, so not to take a stance in the Civil War. However, there was no international law preventing them from sending volunteers to Spain, again in 1,000 of air quotes, because they were not really volunteers. So let's see where these volunteers came from. Well, first of all, we are going to see actual volunteers. The Soviet Union was the main supporter of the Republican Front in Spain. Okay, they were communist, many of the Republicans, but not all of them were communists. So the Soviet Union kept supporting the Republicans in Spain. Throughout the Civil War, they were the most important suppliers of weapons and ammunition to the Republican Front. Despite the embargo, what is an embargo? An embargo is when a country doesn't want other countries to trade with a third country. So, for example, Britain and France, in this case, for reasons which we will explore in a while, said that they didn't want anybody to sell weapons to the Spanish Republican government. However, and so they established an embargo. They forbidden everyone else from trading with Spain, everyone who had signed an agreement, and also those who had not signed the agreement. They did it because they were essentially the bosses of the League of Nations, but it's complicated. The Russians, the Soviets, also sent planes, tanks, and other fighting vehicles, together with about 2,000 soldiers that used them, and that taught the Spanish how to use them. Now, however, as the world first communist country, the Soviets were the leaders of the Comintern, the international organization for the spreading of communism. So they led this huge international organization for the spreading of communism called Comintern, and they used their influence to convince the communist parties and the communist militants of other countries to go and fight in Spain against the fascists in the so-called international brigades, which amounted to around 32,000 soldiers and which included important intellectuals like George Orwell from Britain and Ernest Hemingway. There were several brigades coming from all over Europe and the world. Here you got the English century, century not as in the period of time, but as is the combat unit, it's a name taken from the Roman army. And I think George Orwell fought in this English company. There were also the Garibaldi Company, made of Italian volunteers who were communist and therefore against the fascists. So those were sort of the closest thing we have to proper volunteers working in this war. Now, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy were also using similar workarounds to bypass the international agreements that prevented other countries from intervening into Spain. What did they do? For example, Mussolini sent about 75,000 troops to Spain, claiming they were all, and this time really in inverted commas, volunteers who wanted to defend Europe from communism. In reality, they were absolutely normal units of the Italian army, disguised as anti-communist volunteers. Here we see a Spanish poster saying the Italian invader wants to enslave us, with a hand showing the three colors of the Italian flags and with soldiers there pinching what I assume is Madrid, the city of Madrid, the capital of Spain, judging from its position in the map. Hitler did something very similar and sent around 16,000 men, also disguised as volunteers, including a part of the German Air Force known as the Condor Legion. The Condor Legion would be would do some of the most important atrocities of the war, including the bombing of the Spanish city of Guernica. The support of the Nazis and the fascists, who sent around 80,000 soldiers, 90,000 soldiers, was absolutely fundamental for allowing Francisco Franco, the rebel general, the rebel fascist general, to win against the Republicans. This would establish what was essentially a right-wing, semi-fascist dictatorship, or fully fascist, depending on the point of view, in Spain, which lasted until 1976. Why did it last? Because Spain, despite all the help it received from Italy and Germany during the war, decided to remain neutral during the Second World War. So they did not fight, they remained neutral. So, in all this, why is the Spanish Civil War often referred to as a dress rehearsal of World War II? There are two main reasons. One is political. The Republican Front, so the communists, the anarchists, the Democrats, supported by the Soviet Union, fought against the fascists, which were supported by Italy and Germany. And there were military reasons. The Spanish Civil War was the testing ground for many tactics and technologies that were going to be used during the upcoming war. Politically, the fronts that faced each other during the Spanish Civil War were, as we said, very similar to those that fought each other in World War II. On the one hand, we have a strange alliance of Democrats, anarchists and communists, and on the other you got the two main fascist countries of the world. Ideologically, again, those sides look somewhat similar to those that faced each other during the Second World War. Militarily, the impact of the Spanish War was even more important, because it was the testing ground for tactics and techniques such as massive aerial bombardment, so the use of planes to drop unprecedented amounts of bombs over targeted cities, for example. In 1937, the volunteers of the Condor Legion razed to the ground the Spanish city of Guernica. Here you see what was left of the city after the bombardment. Another example was the use of paratroopers and aerial transport, or the extensive use of tanks and mechanized infantry units. And both the Nazis and the Soviets, but especially the Nazis, would learn a lot from this experience and would use their improved understanding of military tactics again in World War II with huge success, against the French in that case. However, there were also significant differences, the most important of which being the absence, the very loud absence of Britain, France and the United States. While these countries would collaborate directly with the Soviet Union during World War II, in 1936 they were still very much worried about communism, remember the Soviet Union was communism, about communism spreading across Europe. And they were more worried about that than they were about fascist aggression. So the French and the British, who were still the leaders of the League of Nations, forced an embargo on the sale of weapons to the Spanish Republic, because they feared that it would become a Soviet puppet state, because if the Soviets were able to win the war for the Spanish Republic, then the Soviets would also be able to dictate its policy, dictate what the Spanish Republic would do or not do. And this was something that worried a lot the British and the French. And they also worried that Soviet-style communism would spread from Spain to other European countries. For similar reasons, they did not do any such thing. They did not place a similar embargo, and they sort of closed an eye when against Italy and Germany, who still kept sending about 90,000 volunteers to Spain. This had the effect of greatly limiting the ability of the Republicans to fight against the fascist rebels and eventually led to their defeat. This attitude of the two powers that were supposed to lead and guarantee the international order was an anticipation of the so-called appeasement, which would allow Hitler to consolidate his power in Europe in the next years, directly leading to World War II. So, those were more or less the facts. I'm going to read you a model answer to the question. The question is, the Spanish Civil War was an anticipation of the Second World War. How much do you agree with this statement? So, I agree with this statement, since the Spanish Civil War was fought between the Nazis and the Fascists on the one hand, and a wide anti-fascist front led by the Soviet Union on the other. It was also a testing ground for new weapons and tactics which would later be used during the Second World War. However, there were also several differences, including the role of France, Britain and the USA. The two sides that fought each other during the Spanish Civil War were similar, but not identical, to those that fought in World War II. On the one hand, there were the Nazis and the fascist volunteers, soldiers sent by Hitler and Mussolini to stop the communist threat. On the other, there were international communist brigades paid by the Soviet Union, but staffed by communist sympathizers from all over Europe. These two sides would fight each other again in World War II, after the German invasion of Russia in 1941. However, this time the democratic powers, Britain, France and the USA, did not participate, as they were more worried about the expansion of communism in Europe than they were about the fascists winning in Spain. Many of the military tactics and technologies that would become common during World War II were also tested during the Spanish Civil War, which was the first large and modern conflict fought by European powers since the First World War. For example, the Spanish city of Guernica was razed to the ground by a Nazi air raid of unprecedented scale, would probably be a more appropriate word, in 1937, while both the Nazis and the Soviets used what they learned in Spain to develop the tank-based tactics they used in World War II. For these reasons, I believe that the Spanish Civil War can be seen as an anticipation of the Second World War. So, looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.